Leonardo DiCaprio, Brad Pitt, Margot Robbie, nostalgia, multiverse, history, artificial history, hilarious violence. Quentin Tarantino, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. What exactly is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? Like a lot of Quentin Tarantino stories, I can't say that I could pin that down or try to. Covering a huge spectrum, he manages to give us a whole glimpse into a universe long gone. That is very particularly Hollywood, historic Hollywood in the 1960s, with flashbacks to the 1950s, through real life characters, the fictionalized versions of some real life characters, and many in both instances played by current legends or recent legends of Hollywood. It's got a little bit of everything in it, from the landmarks and the businesses to the look to the vehicles. Obviously, it captures the ambience of the time period, but also in that specific place, people online who talk about living there at that time are thrilled by how well it reproduced this real time and place in history. It also manages to give us the story of Rick Dalton, the big cowboy TV star who's in his waning years of his career. Bounty Law, his series, ended up folding after a brief attempt at a movie career. Now he's in that very era of spaghetti westerns and is recruited to go to Rome and film spaghetti westerns. All of this stuff is bits and pieces of Clint Eastwood and a lot of other people's life and history brought together to give us this taste of real Hollywood at that time and place over those years, and the personal angst of the actor, the stuntman, those men who represent a real relationship allegedly in historic Hollywood as well. I'm not going to try to reference all the real people that are referenced, but the brilliant way that we get a real human story, human enough, broad enough that we can certainly relate, we can feel it, and yet it is very specific to this bygone sort of era and the struggles that come with that lifestyle at any time. The changing course of his career, is it waning? Will it be rebooted by the trip to Italy? Those sorts of answers aren't really given. The neat thing about this is we're given the whole flavor of this and watching this unfold. We're meeting up with, we run into hippies that we encounter through our protagonists. We end up being drawn to the Manson family, and there's this really bizarre turn of events where the Manson family murders are going to take place. Margot Robbie playing Sharon Tate, and you wait and see how this unfolds, and then suddenly it unfolds differently than real history. This is the thing about Tarantino stories that tend to go over my head and a lot of people's heads. I think that there's a lot of themes in here, and there certainly is a whole, you could write a book about this movie extrapolating the themes of a more innocent era of Hollywood, and hence a more innocent era of America, of the things we watched on TV that were really basic, black and white, good guy, bad guy, literally black and white on TV at the time, telling the cowboys by the color of their hats. And yet, the preoccupation with violence that Tarantino likes to point out, he exploits to hilarious effect in some instances by going over the top, referencing the culture and his commentary of it going over the top. And we get the hippies talking about growing up with violence on TV, which was softened and like nothing like what we would see on TV now. And nevertheless, the commentary on the culture of violence, but also the basic innocent culture of good versus evil, how that begins to vanish as time goes on, how the 60s in particular complicated all this nationally, artistically, you name it, to see Hollywood, the source of all this entertainment and this mythos, and how it is really losing, I dare to say, its innocence, but it is moving forward into a more dark, nasty, bloody sort of way. And the symbolism of the Manson murders and them in Hollywood losing some of their own to this vicious brutality, bringing this all together in this thematic way. But what's really interesting is giving us the alternate history. That's why I say multiverse. They're not exactly the real people from our time and history. Some of them are real actors and actresses. Some are a plain fictionalized version of actors and actresses. It's almost like you slipped into a parallel universe instead of a fictional film where Rick Dalton was a TV star on a show that didn't exist in our world, how it crosses over and getting a different ending, a happier ending, where the Manson family killers break into literally the most raw possible house and end up being dealt with in brutal, violent fashion, getting exactly what they deserve, and being left with this mythological version where Sharon Tate escapes and the others who were victims of the Mansons, and history will now go forward without that brutality, but with the bad guys having gotten what was coming to them. How then does that unfold in this other reality, this other universe? Would that have caused things to be different artistically, culturally going forward? Probably not enough on its own, but it is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It is the fairy tale version of this, where the bad guys get their comeuppance, the good guys win. It's the bounty law old cowboy show ending to a story that in the real world ended with those brutal murders and people going to prison and the wake of all of that tragedy. And in good quality storytelling fashion, Tarantino, even over the epic length of this film, bringing the callbacks to pass. So the Manson family murders, breaking into the Ron house, getting what they justly deserve, the callback to the acid-dipped cigarette, the weird behavior of Brad Pitt's character, the flamethrower that appears from nowhere, the ridiculousness of the woman out of her mind, berserk, drugs, insanity, pathology, whatever, burnt to a crisp while literally standing in a pool, and all she had to do was duck. And yet the flamethrower we heard about right at the beginning of the film turns up in the garage and is used, and I can't help but laugh. This is the thing that's bizarre. Tarantino, when he does violence, and some of his movies have a lot more than this, but he's really good at doing this random, sudden, extremely brutal violence that is meant to take you off guard. And especially when you see it happening to the bad guys, it really does tickle your funny bone. And I think he intends that to say something about us as a species, perhaps. But when you see these people that are evil, you know what they're up to, and you see them getting what they deserve, and it's sudden, and it's smashing, and it's splattering, and it's the way that they shift around, the way that the bodies are thrown to and fro. It's just really like beating up a rag doll for what reason? And it really just comes across well. Not nearly as much violence in this film as some of Tarantino's work, but it has that same flavor that you find throughout his, that is meant to really drive home a point by being over the top, by being sudden, and we're meant to have that different sort of reaction to it that isn't a hyper dramatic one at any time. But in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you can't help but laugh. At least I couldn't. To be fair, I have never been a big fan of Quentin Tarantino. I mean, I can't say there's a ton of his movies that I really enjoyed. Pulp Fiction was okay. I liked Four Rooms, but then his room in that whole setup was probably my least favorite of the four rooms featured in that film. But Once Upon a Time in Hollywood really does an amazing job of capturing this historical, almost docuseries flavor of real, capturing that nostalgia, which, again, for people that are lovers of Hollywood, lovers of the history of film and cinema, but even for us that aren't, that now we are living in an era where celebrity is far more suspicious, where a lot of us do not relate to celebrities, have been going off the deep end for some time. But I feel like we're just looking at the award show ratings. Fewer and fewer of us today really care a lot about celebrities. But this harkens back to an age when we did, when we looked to George Reeves to be Superman. We looked to Clint Eastwood to be Dirty Harry. We looked to these good guy figures. It was more of a part of our collective mythos. And to see that on film and to see the shattering of it by the Manson murders happen differently and the bad guy get their comeuppance, it really makes this a vastly satisfying film. I give it all sorts of thumbs up. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.